Actually, I want to talk about this at a higher level because I think it's really important. I have been commissioned by World Magazine now to write two pieces. I'm a columnist with World Magazine. And don't talk about it a lot. I want to direct people to Substack, but you need to know the two pieces that I've done at World Magazine. One is on a New York Times story about the increasing divisions within the United States, largely because of abortion. And then the one that is for today is about the ProPublica leak of tax records I spent a little bit of time on last week. Now, I want to put us in the Wayback Machine, and I want us to go very, very, very far back, like 2,000 years backwards, not to Jesus, but to Rome. There's a method to my madness. I am a professional. Bear with me. Rome went through a lot of turmoil over time in its imperial phase. Prior to Diocletian and then after Constantine, there were problems, but really in the run-up to Diocletian becoming emperor, you had the crisis of the 3rd century, and you had emperors rise and fall. You had, I think, 7 emperors in a year? I mean, one would come emperor, then he'd get assassinated. The next one would get assassinated. The next one would die. The next one would get assassinated. It threw the entire empire into chaos. But that chaos was not generally felt by the population. The chaos was not felt by the population in large part because the instruments of Roman society continued to operate as they needed to be operated. If you've ever been to France or to Italy, you can see the Roman aqueduct system. They really are. If you've never been to Europe, and I realize a lot of people have never been to Europe, you should try to go one day. If you go to Nimes and Pont de Gard in France, you can see some of the best preserved aqueducts. What most people don't realize is that the Roman aqueducts, by and large, ran underground. They didn't even run in the great arches and stuff, the great spans. They didn't run that way. Rome developed certain tools and derived tools from the Greeks. The Greeks were the original inventors of the aqueduct. But every 5 miles, the Roman aqueduct would descend a foot. And so it was a constant sloping and reduction to their destination. And the Romans, with various survey tools that they and the Greeks had invented, were able to build these elaborate water delivery systems. Now, there were cisterns to collect rainwater for the poor and for drinking water and the like, but by and large, these came in to supply the fountains and the wealthy with their water, and ultimately, over time, supplied water fountains from which people could get their drinking water throughout the Roman Empire. From France to Italy to Greece, you name it, there were aqueducts, and they were amazing instruments of architecture. To this day, we actually don't understand everything that went into their construction. During the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of our knowledge was lost, including the Roman development of hydraulic concrete. Hydraulic concrete is a concrete that continues to get stronger and stronger as it gets wet. It's a remarkable piece of engineering that scientists in the 21st century are only starting to really relearn how to make. Yes, Roman concrete from 2,000 years ago actually holds up better than modern concrete used globally. The Romans did impressive things. And while they were in the crisis of the 3rd century, an emperor fell and rose and fell and rose and fell and rose, the Roman Empire worked. The aqueducts continued to provide water. More importantly, the Roman bureaucracy worked. So while the emperors could fight each other and Praetorian guards could assassinate emperors, the tax collectors kept collecting the taxes. The mints kept producing the coinage. Law enforcement continued to keep the cities safe. The legions, not on the front lines, continued to patrol the roads of the Roman Empire to make sure the criminals and pirates were kept at bay. The port authorities continued to keep their ports open, so the flow of not just goods, but harvested wheat continued to feed the empire. The empire did not go to starving and did not collapse because the Roman bureaucracy continued to function in the best interests of Rome as a whole. however factionalized it was. There was not team member of this and team member of that. There were not partisans within the bureaucracy. It just functioned. And so through all the crises, Rome operated. That gets me to a couple of stories that have happened in the last couple of weeks. One is the FBI story, the trial of the men accused of trying to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, collapsed. The jury found 3 of the 4 not guilty and got hung up on the 4th. The salacious details of the FBI turned out not to be true. The Durham report has released a little more. You have not heard this in major news outlets. The Durham report, Mr. Durham investigating the origins of the Steele dossier, turns out concluded that it was not practically possible that Donald Trump was an agent of the Russians. It was essentially invented by the shoppers of the Steele dossier, and too many people bought it because of their contempt for Donald Trump. But there was no way it could have been real. Members of the FBI, you will recall, fell for this and weaponized the FBI to go after the President of the United States. And then there's the IRS. In 2010, the IRS, under Lois Lerner, the director of exempt organizations, began to release documents about Tea Party groups, but also obstruct the ability of conservative activist groups from getting nonprofit tax status. Progressive groups, some of them were exposed and blocked, but frankly, many of the progressive groups were allowed to go forward, and the Democratic groups were not. There was a congressional investigation. Lois Lerner was held in contempt of Congress, and even Democratic members of Congress called on her to either resign or be fired when it came out that she had been weaponizing the IRS against conservatives. Because even the Democrats, like Carl Levin in the Senate, knew that if you begin to weaponize the IRS against political opponents, you begin to jeopardize the legitimacy of the institutions of the American bureaucracy that the United States actually needs to continue to operate in good times and bad. Now, fast forward to this, as I mentioned the other day, ProPublica, a left-wing nonprofit investigative journalism outfit. Someone from the IRS leaked to ProPublica the information, the private tax information of the 400 wealthiest Americans. These are people who make on average about $110 million a year. A lot of wealthy Americans, like Warren Buffett, for example, don't make a lot of money every year. Believe it or not, Warren Buffett, I think he makes $24 million a year, which is a lot for you and me. But it's small. It's a pittance compared to the 400 wealthiest Americans, the Bill Gateses of the world, the Walton family from Walmart, make hundreds of millions of dollars a year in income and file 1040s. Some, like Warren Buffett and others, they borrow against their wealth so they can offset their tax liability with loans. It brings down the amount of money they pay in taxes. These are all perfectly legal tax schemes that have come out of our complicated tax code that Congress has blessed or the IRS has sanctioned. But of the 400 wealthiest Americans, it's not a coincidence that this ProPublica report comes, not just as tax filing season is here. Today is the day to file your taxes or your extension, but also as Democrats want to tax these wealthy Americans. It is not a coincidence, I don't believe, that this information about these 400 wealthiest Americans leaked as Democrats, including President Biden, are set to unveil a new tax proposal to tax the wealthy. And there are a lot of people out there who say, well, so they're wealthy. Why should I care? You should care because justice requires that you care. The operations of our government as a united government in which we can trust require justice. And justice requires that you care about people who are unlike you. When the George Floyd matter happened and George Floyd was laid on the ground with the knee of the officer on his neck all those many minutes, there were some on the right said, well, George Floyd's a terrible guy. He was on drugs. He was a criminal. And a lot of us, myself included, are like, regardless of George Floyd's past, no American should have a knee on their neck that long, like that, in that situation. And justice required that though Some of us have nothing in common with George Floyd. For our common humanity, we should be outraged by it. And there were some on the right who refused because of his record, because of his past behavior, because it's I got to stand with the police, regardless of what the individual officer did. The same way, the media and the left turned on Nick Sandmann. Nick Sandmann was the young man in Washington at a pro-life rally who was vilified by the press, claiming that he was assaulting, obstructing, or otherwise abusing the rights of an American Indian protester. It turns out it was the American Indian protester who caused everything. And by the way, that guy spoke out and said what had happened after some cajoling. It turned out Nick Sandmann was innocent of everything he was accused of. He wound up suing and getting a lot of money, and he was vilified by people on the left. But justice must not care who the person is or whose politics they're in. For our system to work, we must be blind to it. And so we are blind to it. We show ourselves blind, and we get outraged by injustices to the poor, to people who are of different races. But increasingly with partisans, we have a hard time saying justice demands this because we don't like the guy, so we don't care what justice does. And the same holds true for this. There are a lot of people say, well, it's the richest Americans. Who cares? Screw them. This is for the greater good. This exposition, the exposing them is for the greater good, says every tyrant ever. If you can't care about this, if you can't care that the IRS is weaponizing itself, that partisan progressives within the IRS are weaponizing the IRS, you're ultimately going to be made to care when the system of justice collapses, when the system of trust in government collapses, when the respect for the bureaucracy collapses, and it's already collapsing. We have a problem. The Romans could weather the storm of the crisis of the 3rd century because everyone agreed the Roman bureaucracy could be trusted to function. Very few people these days agree the American bureaucracy can be trusted to function. And if that's the case, we have bigger problems than the Roman Empire had. So many people want to compare us to the Roman Empire. We're not even at the imperial stage yet. We're rapidly headed towards that imperial stage, I suspect, as the precursor events within the Roman Republic, the graft, the greed, the corruption, the turning on each other are foreshadowing what's happening in the United States right now. Something wicked this way comes within this country when we as a people decide our measure of what is just and unjust is based on whether we like the people, not what was done to them. And what is done now is our American bureaucracy is being weaponized against partisans, weaponized against people, weaponized against the unpopular in order to affect public policy. That's not the way the system's supposed to work. And if it keeps working that way, the whole house is going to collapse. Something's got to be done, and it's outrageous to me that no one in the media or in the political realm is willing to speak up and do anything because it just so happens that the victims are very wealthy. If you're not willing to say anything about the victims because they're very wealthy, at some point, people won't say anything about the victims who are very poor. And at that point, the whole thing comes crashing down around us. We got real problems, and someone needs to do something in Washington.
Want to be on the show? Call Eric now at